that I had done about my story with MS um, are inaccessible at this time. And so I urgently wanted to get you some more information because so many of you say that you've never heard of MS or you've never known someone with MS. And the two new videos that I was able to load this semester, which is summer 2019, were of Selma Blair, who's at a very early stage of MS, and then a young man named Seb, who's been living with MS for longer. And every one of the things about multiple sclerosis is that it is absolutely different for everybody. Um, the symptoms, to some extent, the prognosis, um, but it's a really individual illness and disease. Um, so I thought it's really helpful to students to sort of put a face and a known quantity to somebody who struggles with MS, and in my case, has been for 15 to 25 years. So here goes. I don't know at this point if I'm going to do this in a few different clips, depending on how wordy I am, because there are a number of areas that I think it's important for me to cover for you. So, welcome to my journey. So, I have multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed in 2006 at the age of 30. So, I often say that I'm the poster child for MS. And what I mean by that is that in terms of my gender, being female, in terms of my race, being Caucasian, um, in terms of my geography, growing up in the Mid-Atlantic region, and in terms of the age of diagnosis, I'm kind of right at the average of all of them. So, well, as we've gained knowledge about MS and it's being diagnosed earlier, and there's much more prevalence of MS in the United States than previously thought, um, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. Um, there are areas of the country and areas of the world that are more prone to MS and those that are less prone. As you get closer to the equator, in general, those areas become less prone. As you go further away from the equator, um, the United States, Europe, those areas are more prone. And my family is Belgian and Italian. I grew up in the United States in the DC area. So those are areas, those are all sort of geographic factors that increase my risk. I also smoked since the time I was very young until early midlife. And new research has come out that cigarette smoking is can be an important trigger for somebody who already has the propensity to develop an autoimmune disorder and multiple sclerosis. So there are a number of precipitating factors, and nobody knows what causes MS, and there is no cure for MS. So all they can do is try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Most people are diagnosed at about 30, in their early 30s. My partner has MS, and maybe I'll go into that later. She was not diagnosed until her mid-40s, so it varies. And that's not just because of symptom onset, but it varies in terms of what name doctors put on your early symptoms because they can look like a lot of other things. Anyway, so the early signs. So when I was diagnosed in 2006, according to my MRI lesions, my first neurologist said he would suspect I had MS already for 10 years. So looking back historically, what were some of the early signs and symptoms of MS? In my 20s, I had been very clumsy. I was in graduate school. I was really clumsy, but it was sort of my MO. Like I was really good at falling, like the tumble rolls, and um, it was just sort of this quirky, kooky thing about me, and I didn't get hurt, and I thought it was funny, and most people I knew thought it was funny. So I didn't pay any attention to the fact that I was clumsy, and that I was clumsier than I had been when I was a child. I was also in the first time in an extremely hot climate in Arizona, and under a tremendous amount of stress in graduate school. So those things I'm sure contributed. Um, in the early 2000s, so in 2001, I had graduated. I was working in a really stressful research analyst job. Um, and I started to have three symptoms that probably should have alarmed me a lot more than they did at the time. I would walk my dog in the early mornings, and I started to notice, even after going 1 block, and I was quite fit and had done yoga and exercised all my life. After going just around my block, my right foot would start to droop and drop, and I would trip over it. Like the ankle would just stop holding the foot up in a position where you wouldn't fall on it when you tried to step. And I later learned that's a classic symptom of MS called foot drop, where your foot stops to respond to the nerve messages telling it how to walk. So I developed foot drop, which I noticed on these dog walks. The other embarrassing and horrifying thing that I developed on these dog walks in the early morning was urinary and bowel incontinence, or urgency, I would say. And they separate those two. Urgency is you have to go right now. So if you can get yourself to a bathroom, if you're within shooting distance of a bathroom, you're probably good. But I was out on the streets with my dog, and I wasn't good. So that started happening. It was so embarrassing and horrifying to me. I would tell no one. And it was like 5 o'clock in the morning, so no one would witness it, and I could go home, take a shower, start the day, and live with this like horrifying new reality that I didn't link to anything, strangely enough, looking back. In 2005, I started working at Estrella. Prior to that, from 2001 to 2005, I was actually in my postdoc internship. Postdoc is sort of extra training you get when you're done with your doctoral degree in a specific area, and mine was in health psych, and particularly it was in women's health psychology. So I was working in a clinical research lab teaching people with chronic pain and progressive illnesses about coping, psychological and emotional types of coping with chronic illness and pain, which is very ironic because I was developing MS at that time, although unaware of it. And I was learning the coping strategies that I would desperately come to need and use all the time within a few years. But at the time, it was my work, and I loved it. I loved working with the people with chronic illness. I loved helping them find ways to cope, talking to them about identity, just all of the work of helping somebody come to terms with an unimaginably bad diagnosis and physical state. Was really lucky timing for me, it turns out. So in 2005, I came to Estrella, and a couple things changed when I was at Estrella that made it much worse. Number one, I was dropping things. I'm a big coffee drinker, and probably every morning, probably several times a day, I would drop my coffee mug because I'm right-handed and I hold everything in my right hand. So I would drop my coffee mug and always had coffee spilled on everything, a gazillion broken mugs. And again, I didn't think much of it. I had a lot of life stress, a new job. I was actually waiting for my first child, who was in Guatemala, and I was nearing the end of the adoption process, which is lengthy and stressful and expensive. And I was learning how to teach and loving my job at Estrella. And I was dropping things. I would drop my keys constantly. I would think they were still in my hand when I get to my car, from my office to my car, and I would find they weren't in my hand. So I hadn't even noticed that something had dropped out of my hand. So my right hand started giving me real trouble, and I continued to ignore it. Denial is a really powerful coping mechanism. Um, Rewind a little. When I had been in my postdoc years at ASU, I used to go to the gym and work out, and I would work out on the elliptical machine, and my right leg would go totally numb. So by the time my workout was finished, I couldn't stand on my own. Um, I couldn't feel my leg. I would have to stand next to the machine and cling to the machine, literally holding me up for 5 to 10 minutes, and then my leg would come back on board and I could walk to the locker room and then sit there on the bench or lay on the bench for some time until my body sort of let up this strange paralysis on the right side and let me go about my business. But because it was transient, I remember worrying sometimes when I was on the elliptical that something bad was happening to my leg, but I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't have time to deal with it. I didn't want to deal with it. I moved on. That time I was working at Estrella and dropping things. I was very clumsy. I used to joke with my students because I would sit up on those tables that are in the front of the classrooms, and then occasionally I would just fall off, or I wouldn't hit the table correctly, and I would just like fall on my ass in front of the classroom. And so I explained it at the time as probably a problem with the balance centers at the back of your brain. And I said, so, this is a problem with this part of my brain, and nobody be alarmed. And like, I probably won't hurt myself, so don't freak out. So it was like all a big joke to me, which was my way of coping. Then Easter of 2016, so the adoption is almost final, and I'm almost ready to go get my son in Guatemala. I was hiking in the Estrella Mountains, and my whole right side of my body went numb and paralyzed, worse than it had ever been. So my former partner, who I was hiking with, basically had to kind of drag me out, and it was terrifying. I was really terrified. I was more paralyzed than I had ever been. It was my full right side. We got to the car. I sat in the car, the air conditioner blasting, and it was a very hot day. And in about 10 minutes, I could use my right side again. I could use my right leg again. So I still wanted to ignore it because of its transience, but I didn't. I went to my physician and she said, you have a problem with your spine, clearly, and I'm going to send you to a neurologist to find out what the problem is. And so she sent me to my first neurologist, who, by the time I got to his office, I really couldn't walk. I could certainly not walk a straight line. I kind of wall walked, like leaning on the wall down to his office. And he did all these neurological tests. Could I close my eyes and touch my nose? Which I could not. I would often end up over here, up here. And so that's something they do to see if you have, it's called proprioception, if your nerves are firing correctly so that you know where you are in space and where your body parts are in space. He did this test where he ran a needle up my foot, and you've probably never noticed this, but now that you know, you will. With babies, with infants, if you run something sharp or even your fingernail up the bottom of their foot, their toes will flex up. It's called the Babinski response. After their neurons start to myelinate in their brain, you run something up their foot and their toes will curl down. You can try it now. If you run something up the bottom of your foot, your toes will curl down. That's an appropriate permanently myelinated neuron. Once your neurons that go to your foot lose that myelin, you recover the Babinski response of infancy and your toes go up. So my neurologist said, that's not good, Babinski response. And being a Psych 101 teacher, I knew what it was. And I thought, that's not good. And then he wanted me to take a short walk in his office with my eyes closed. Again, it tests proprioception, it tests coordination. And I did so. And I staggered like a drunken fool, hit a wall. He was like, that's enough, I'm good, I got it. So he sent me for an MRI of my brain and spine and said, I'm very convinced by your clinical results that there is something deeply wrong with your spine, and it's one of two things. You either have multiple sclerosis or you have a brain tumor. So that's tough when you're about to be a new mom and you're 30 and you have a new job that you love, to process either. But I went home and I wished and prayed and hoped that the results would come back as a brain tumor, because my thinking was at least a brain tumor is removable in some cases. So it either kills you or they remove it and you go on with your life. But I knew MS was a progressive neurological disease that resulted in multiple disabilities over time and for which there was no cure. You know what diagnosis I got. So I'll do a section later on coping. That was the beginning. So let me go a little bit into treatments, because at the time they treat active episodes. So my first diagnosis was relapsing remitting, which is the most common diagnosis. It means that there are these attacks on your brain and spinal cord from your own immune system that take the myelin off the axon, so your brain cannot communicate to parts of your bodies that have unmyelinated axons. So that if the myelin is only damaged, you'll get intermittent signals like a static ETV, where there is some electricity running through, but it's not going to the right place or it's not getting there in the right amount. Once the axon is totally demyelinated, you get nothing. So you just can't use that part of your body anymore. Forget how I got off on that. So I was waiting for my son. One of the things I should say is that I feel blessed and lucky every single day that I do not have any cognitive impairments related to MS. Many people do. It can attack the parts of the neurons of your brain that help you think, help you remember, etc. I am so blessed because I can continue to do what I love, and I have no cognitive impairment. This, what you're witnessing now, is just merely a jumble of information in my mind and forgetting where I left off when I took a side road, as I tend to. So, treatments. I was at treatments. So they try to start you. They always want to start you on a disease-modifying drug immediately, because the idea with relapsing remitting is the quicker they can start you on a disease-modifying drugs, all of which basically shut down all or part of your immune system, the quicker they can slow down the disease. Remember, there's no cure, so the medications offered were at that time they all had the same profile. You injected them. They took down all or part of your immune system in different ways, because they don't know exactly what causes MS, so they don't know what to target. So it's a little bit of a scattershot approach. All of them had an efficacy rate of about 30% in reducing relapses. So what that means is you're slowing down the disease progression by 30%. That's pretty bad, given how progressive and disabling MS is. But when it's the only thing they have, you're grateful for that, because 10 years prior they had nothing. They would tell people who were diagnosed with MS, go home and lay in bed. You will lose your ability to do everything, and there's nothing we can do. So at the time that I was diagnosed, they had this set of disease modifiers, um, mostly called interferon drugs, that would modify the course, would slow it down to a somewhat small degree, but it was something to give you hope. So I had to be traveling regularly to Guatemala, and I could not bring all these needles, injections to do every day. So I said, okay, hit me up with a ton of IV steroids, which will calm down the inflammation in my brain and spinal cord for now, because I need to go move to Guatemala until I can get my son home. And then I'll start your needles when I come back. So I did 3 days of intravenous steroids, which is a treatment I would continue somewhat regularly for the first 7-8 years of the disease, because it just calms everything down. I went to Guatemala. I lived there for 2 months with my son while his paperwork was processed and we finalized the adoption. I was walking. In fact, I was very stabilized with him in a baby carrier, because Guatemala has really uneven streets, and I don't know if it was psychological or physical, but with my son in the baby carrier, I felt like I walked better than at any other time. I brought my son home 2 months later and started the disease-modifying drugs. The one I was taking, and is pretty typical of those drugs, would give me flu symptoms for the days following. So I would inject every other day, 3 times a week, and for 1 to 2 days afterwards, the day of the injection and 1 to 2 days afterward, I would feel like I had a flu. I'd be fatigued. I'd be a little feverish, feel really under the weather, achy. But I had a little baby, and he was my dream come true. And I had this job, which was my other dream come true. And I just barreled through, which is kind of my personality, thankfully, to barrel through. My mom wasn't big on, not big at all on feeling sorry for yourself. You just put one foot in front of the other, do what you have to do. And that's been really helpful to me throughout my life. Okay, so that's the early stuff. I'm going to stop here because I think I'm probably already at about 20 minutes. And I know sometimes it's easier for students to watch things in blocks. So I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to go in the next one to disease progression, various symptoms, disabilities that I've developed, assistive devices that I've used to cope, therapies that have been helpful, current issues, and in the end I'll do one on coping. So I'll see you again.